Gamaya Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityormamritam Gamaya Aviravirmaedhi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mampahi Nityam Tena Mampahi Nityam. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourself, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Om Vishnur Tripurantako Bhavatu Va Brahma Surendrotha Va Bhanur Va Shashalakshanota Bhagavan Buddhota Siddhota Va Ragadvesha Visharti Moharahita Sattvanukampodhyato Yasarvai Sahasamskrito Gunaganais Tasmai Namah Sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So good morning and Happy New Year to everyone. I wasn't here for January 1st, Kalpataru Day celebration, but many of you were. In fact, I hear that we had 60 people, which is a very good attendance. So take this opportunity to wish you a Happy New Year. And because it's the new year, usually at the beginning of the year, I like, when I have to speak, I like to speak on some topic about beginnings or endings, or beginnings and endings, that being appropriate. So today I've chosen to speak on the question, where do we go from here? And so where do we go from here, of course, can be approached in different ways. But I will approach it from the standpoint of where do we go as a movement, the Ramakrishna Sangha, and again the Sangha meaning the large family of Ramakrishna devotees and monastics. And then finally, where do we go as a society, the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston? What can we do in the future that might be good for the society? After more than 100 years, well more than 100 years, let's see, it's now 125 years that we have been in this country since Swami Vivekananda came in the summer of 1893. So after 125 years, it's certainly good to look back and to see what has been done, and on the basis of that, what to do in the future. Swami Vivekananda said in his rules for the order that continuity should be respected. That is, the work of predecessors should be respected. That's because there's the tendency of everyone taking charge of a work for the first time, like when I came to Houston or whatever, to turn everything upside down and say, well, I'm going to put the Atmarupananda stamp on everything, so that everybody knows that I did this, and this is my center, and I have given a shape to it. And so when you look at the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston, you may not see it printed, but you'll see Swami Atmarupananda all over everything. Oh no, that's not the idea. That shouldn't be the idea. The idea should be a continuity. Yes, there's always room for change, for growth, but that change should be organic and not neither ego-driven nor just change for the sake of change. The two things in that regard that have to be avoided, one is a Western tendency and the other is an Indian tendency. The Western tendency is change for change's sake. Change itself is good. So change things and that's good. Well, no, change for change's sake is not good. You look at a culture like Japan, the same could be said for India, but let's look at a third country like Japan, where traditionally in the traditional Japanese painting, the same styles went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, for 1,000 years, the same styles in painting. In the West, every artist feels, well, I have to break all the old molds and do something which is completely new. And of course, much of what is done is completely new, is utterly ridiculous, and won't stand the test of time. But the Japanese were far wiser, where they would go on perfecting the same forms. And yes, there was change, but that change was organic and evolutionary, not intentional that I have to be different from everybody else. That started in the West, especially in the 19th century, in the arts and in music and etc., where everyone who wants to make a mark has to be revolutionarily different. So that people will say, well, the age of Swami Atmarupananda's music started on this date with him. Though, of course, I'm not a musician, so just using my name and rather than casting aspersions on someone else's name. And the other problem I said was the opposite, that is the Indian tendency, which we see in the order. I don't mean among you, but we see in the order. That is that anything that has been done once becomes a sacred tradition which everyone is afraid to change. And so even when things need to be changed, no one is willing to change them because, well, it was done by our revered seniors, so how could we possibly change it? So we have to find something in between where needed change is recognized and is carried forward, but not for the sake of change. Either because society has changed and we have to adapt to the changes of society, or because we see a way of doing the same thing which is more effective, and we go with that. At one time in India, in Indian tradition, of course in India now everything is changing under the influence of the modern world. Everything is being turned upside down. But in traditional India, in ancient India, there was tremendous creativity. You see that from the fact that there are so many different religious ideas, different religious practices, different religious traditions which grew up. If it had been purely repetitive, then that wouldn't have happened. Everybody would just go on doing the same thing, repeating the same thing over and over. But that's not what happened. There was tremendous creativity in India. And Swamiji wanted to bring that back. But again, in a wise way, not in the Western way of worshiping newness for newness' sake. So, looking backward and looking forward. When Swamiji, we'll start with Swamiji. When Swamiji first came to the West, Sri Ramakrishna saw that in time he would have many devotees in the West, but he never came to the West and didn't know much about the West. But Swami Vivekananda did come, as you know, and his was a deep and profound mind, which shed light on whatever he looked at. And so coming to the West, he brought his vastly educated and profound, spiritually profound mind, intellectually and spiritually profound mind, and began his work here. He started the Vedanta work. And as we can see from his letters, his own statements, when he first came to America, he said that he came to collect money. To collect money, he had heard that America was a generous country and that people were open to new ideas. So he came to collect money to establish his work in India. His focus was on India. When he had traveled all around India as a parivrajaka, he had meditated on India and the needs of India, the past and the future, the past, present, and future of India. And so he was filled with that, with the vision of what India needed to enter into the modern age with advantage, not with the disadvantages she had at that time, being a colonized country. slave country. So when he came, he thought, well, I'll come to America, raise money. And that's why he took a job with the lecture bureau after the Parliament. He found that his lectures at the Parliament were extremely successful. People asked him to stay on, and so he decided to take a job with the lecture bureau, travel around, make some money, and then he would return to India. And that was a terrible experience for him, but it also was a useful experience, as often happens in life, as Swamiji himself knew. It was a terrible experience because the lecture bureau took advantage of him. They worked him to the bone. They sent him all over. They sent him to give lectures on Vedanta in coal mining towns in West Virginia and Kentucky and places like that, where people had no interest in India, or they just came to see some guy with a turban on his head, which they'd never seen before. Some brown-faced man with a turban and a funny-looking robe and coat. So he spent months doing that, feeling that he was doing nothing of use, and even the money, they were not giving him the amount of money that he should have gotten from the work. But during that time, he met ordinary America. He saw, at the Parliament, he had seen the best of religious America and of high society, but now he saw America as it was, and he learned a great deal. And he began to see that there was a need here, First need he saw was to correct people's misinterpretation of India, or misimpressions, bad impressions of India, which had been given deliberately by Christian missionaries who wanted to give a bad impression of India so that they could collect money for saving these heathen who threw their babies to crocodiles and did other horrible things in their telling. And so you see in the first couple of years in the West, in the end of 93, 94, the beginning of 95, most of his lectures were about India and correcting the misinterpretations. In fact, after a year in America and many battles, open public battles with missionaries, it was found that the donations to missionaries in America dropped by a large percentage. I forget what the exact percentage was, but it's in Marie-Louise Burke's books. But it was a large, very significant amount that the donations to Christian missionaries dropped because Swamiji gave a very different idea of India to the people. But he began to see that there was a need for work here, that there was a need for spiritual education here, that people needed spiritual values. There were many things about America that he appreciated, but he saw that it was all founded on very superficial foundation. The belief in democracy, the belief in equality, the belief in individual freedom was all founded on sand, as it were. There was no spiritual foundation for it, and he realized that nothing can last without a spiritual foundation. So he began to teach Vedanta. He had started by emphasizing at the Parliament of Religions and afterwards the harmony of all religions, that we accept all religions, as he said at the Parliament of Religions. We believe all religions are true. And he held that, of course, to the end of his life. That was fundamental. It was part of Ramakrishna's realization. But if all religions are true, where was the need to teach Vedanta? Why did he find a need to teach Vedanta? If all religions are true, there's already religion here. In those days, most people were Christian, and then there were some Jews. There wasn't much else. Spiritualism, but that was a peculiar form of Christianity where they talked to ghosts and communicated with the dead, but it was basically a form of Christianity. So if all religions are true, again, why teach Vedanta? Because Swamiji found that, first of all, nobody else is talking about and nobody else has the perception that all religions are true. It's from a Vedantic perspective that you can see that all religions are true. Even a great man whom I have great regard for and have met several times, a great man like the Dalai Lama, who talks about the need for respect among all religions and that we all have to work together and we all have to accept each other and all of that. When he is pointedly asked, but are all religions equally true, then he'll finally say, as he has said, that will know. We believe that Buddhism is the highest truth, but other religions are good. Other religions are good. But if you want the highest truth, you have to come to Buddhism. So even the most liberal of religious exponents has trouble coming to the idea that all religions in themselves are true. So Vedanta has a purpose there, to teach that all religions are true. But Swamiji saw that it had much more than that. That was just one aspect of what its value was. There was a much larger aspect. As he said, at the end of 1894, when this idea was coming to the forefront of his mind, and he began with his teaching of Vedanta more purposefully, he said in answer to a question in New York City that I have a message for the West as Buddha had a message for the East. And Swamiji didn't say such things casually. He said that with full awareness of what he was speaking of, that he was aware of the tremendous significance of the Buddha's message. He spoke so often on Buddhism in America that newspaper reporters routinely thought that he was a Buddhist. Many of his lectures were about Buddha and Buddhistic India. And even towards the end of his teaching in America in 1900, he was still sometimes speaking about Buddha and his message. And so he knew the greatness of the Buddha. He used to say that all religions of the world have been influenced by that one man, the Buddha, that his influence spread over the world. And he believed that Christianity in its formation had been deeply influenced at its roots by Buddhism. And that is historically supportable also. Not provable, but supportable. So when he said that I have a message for the West as Buddha had a message for the East, he meant something tremendous. He didn't mean, well, Buddha taught a few nice things, and so I'll teach a few nice things, and a few people may benefit from it, and that's that. No. By comparing his message to the West with Buddha's message to the East, he was fully recognizing then, by the end of 1894, that he had an earth-shaking message, which would shake the very foundations of the Western world and the world at large. So he saw that the West needed the Vedanta philosophy. For one thing, it showed the spiritual foundations of the American experiment in democracy. We still speak of the American experiment because in historical terms, America is still a young country. And so it's still an experiment, and sometimes going better and sometimes going worse with our experiment in democracy, even in the present time. And so he saw that the Vedanta philosophy had something to offer to the West. It had a foundation for society itself. Not just for the West, for the world at large, but he taught in different ways in the West and in the East, in India in particular. And had he taught in China and Japan, he would have taught differently there as well. But here he spoke, he spoke about the universal philosophy of the Vedanta and how it could serve as the foundation for a new world culture, for a new world paradigm. That is, Swamiji presented a new vision of humanity, a new vision of the world itself, a new vision of society, a new vision of nations that would serve as the foundation for a new paradigm. Many things in the present paradigm which has governed civilization around the world for millennia, much of that paradigm now has come to its end. It's no longer functioning. Whether you look at the social level, whether you look at the political level, whether you look at the idea of the nation state, whether you look culturally, artistically, everywhere, you find that the old paradigm, if you have eyes to see, you see that the paradigm is not working. The economy itself, it may survive for many more years, it may survive for another century or two, or maybe three, probably not that long, but maybe. But the economy itself is broken because it's based on false premises. The justice system is broken because it's based on false premises. The idea of democracy is broken because it's based on false premises. The inspiration is true, and that Swamiji approved of and was very fond of, and thought that that would spread, as he said in his poem to the 4th of July, that that would spread around the world as we see that it is, but that it needed a spiritual foundation. And so Swamiji began to see that the world needed Vedanta. Again, all religions are true, so why Vedanta? Because philosophy is important, ideas are important. If you say, as we believe, as Ramakrishna himself realized and taught, and as Swami Vivekananda realized and taught, that all religions are true, and then someone comes and says, well, then my religion is true, and you say, yes, your religion has produced many great saints, that's the proof that it's true. Many knowers of God, that's the proof that it's true. And then the person says, yes, but my religion teaches that my religion alone is true and all other religions are false. And so if my religion is true, then that's true, that all other religions are false. Then of course you've got a tautology, you've come to a contradiction. And so philosophy is important. Swamiji's idea of human nature is important. Yes, it's true. You can believe that human nature is sinful by nature. And believing that, sincerely believing that, and founding your life and your philosophy and your religion on that, you can attain to God. Yes, that's true. But Swamiji saw that certain ideas have harmful effects on society. And so therefore he taught Vedanta and began the Vedanta work in the West. And so that's what our mission is. So again, what will go forward from Swamiji, based on Swamiji, but go forward from there. What have we accomplished in the last 125 years? Of course, during Swamiji's time, he made a huge impression on this country. That's hard to realize now because so few people in this country have heard of Swami Vivekananda. But in his time, many people had heard of him. Some people had the blessing of seeing him. Some fewer had the blessing, though it was still quite significant, had the blessing of hearing him and even speaking with him. But he had a tremendous impression, made a tremendous impression on this country, so that his name was recognized in newspapers around the country. But then after Swamiji's time, then the work became much quieter. Swami Abhedananda and Swami Trigunatitananda, Swami Turiyananda, all disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, they worked and had success. They were successful. Swami Abhedananda in particular, he went to many places where it took almost a century before our Swamis went. He went to Mexico, he went to Alaska, he went to Russia, to Siberia, he traveled through Europe, he went to so many places where it took almost a century before people followed in his footsteps. And he also was quite successful. Swami Swami Trigunatitanandaji, he was very radical in his teaching of Vedanta in the Western world. He built what he called the first Vedanta temple in the Western world, or the first Hindu temple in the Western world. But it was really more of a Vedanta temple. It was not a Hindu temple as Hindus think of temples, where there was a deity in the shrine and people come and break coconuts and offer gulab jamun and rasagola, etc., and then take the prasad home. It was nothing like that. It was like our centers now, a Vedanta temple in that sense, as a Vedanta center. But much more radical than that. That was not so radical. It was, though his building is an architectural monument in San Francisco even now. And it was recently refurbished in a grand way. It was about $3.5 million that they spent on redoing the San Francisco temple, which didn't even have a foundation. They found, as they had done different work improving the plumbing and things, they had to drill through what they thought was a foundation, and there was no foundation there. So they now have put in the last 4 or 5 years, they put a foundation under the building. They stripped all of the plaster inside, redid all the wiring and plumbing and so forth. But the external shell is still the external shell, and that is an architectural monument in San Francisco. Even when you see promotional videos about San Francisco produced by the city for tourism, you'll often see a picture of the Vedanta temple, the old temple in San Francisco. So Swami Trigunatitanandaji, a direct disciple of Ramakrishna, was very radical in his approach, as I said. He started many things. He was the first to start a monastery and a convent, both a monastery and a convent. He had his monks and nuns give lectures, give talks. He was the first to do that, and it was many decades before any other Swami had Westerners speaking, Western monastic speaking. And he started a community in Concord, California. We bought a large piece of property and was going to subdivide it, build in the center a Vedanta temple there, and then have devotees live all around. It was an intentional community that he was developing. Something like the Transcendentalists had dreamed about, and something which in the hippie days, much later, people tried in various ways. But he wanted to start an intentional Vedanta community where the Vedanta devotees would live all around the temple. But he was killed before that could take place. And after his death, the next Swami was not interested, and he sold the land in order to pay off debts on the building of the temple. But in those early days, they started a magazine, the Pacific Vedantin, which started even during Swami Turiyananda's time, started by devotees, the Pacific Vedantin, the first Vedanta magazine in the Western world. And then there was the Shanti Ashram, land which had been given to Swami Vivekananda, which he turned over to Swami Turiyanandaji and asked him to start a meditation retreat there, which he did. And then Swami Trigunatitanandaji continued with the retreats at Shanti Ashram. And Shanti Ashram is still there, though it's not used anymore as a retreat. Maybe someday it will be, I hope it will be. But the land is still there under the Vedanta Society of San Francisco. And Swami Trigunatitanandaji, he also had a number of radical ideas. Another one that I mentioned, besides forming an intentional community, he had the idea that it would be good to mix the blood of India and America. And so he encouraged intermarriage between Indians and Americans because he felt that that would be good for both countries. Of course, in those days there was more belief in the value of such genetic mixtures, or as they called it at that time, a mixture of blood, than there is nowadays. But his idea was a radical one, that he encouraged the intermarriage between Indians and Americans. And so he only lived until 1915, and then he was killed again at a Christmas Eve service by one of his own disciples who had gone mad. But the work that Swami Trigunatitananda did, that Swami Vivekananda did, Swami Turiyananda did, and that later Swamis have done, it's the austerities that they did and their great ideas which are the foundation on which we work now. They were the pioneers, people like Swami Prabhavananda in Hollywood, who in his early years oftentimes had nothing to eat at night but popcorn and milk. That was his supper because there was just no money for food. When he began to collect some money and began to build the Hollywood Temple, which is still the Hollywood Temple, when he ran out of money, he just boarded it up and said, no, we won't borrow money. If we don't have more money, we'll just board it up. And when money comes, we'll start again. And that's what he did. And so people, Swamis who started with great difficulty, Swami Satprakashananda in St. Louis, when he went there, he had come to this country and had tried Washington, D.C. and maybe one or two other places and had failed. And so he went to see Swami Ashokananda in San Francisco. And Swami Ashokananda said, well, let us find a place where there is no Vedanta work and then start something there. And so they took out a map of America, marked the places where there were Vedanta centers and groups of devotees, which were very few at that time, just on the two coasts and Chicago. And so then he said, we need something, Swami Ashokananda said, we need something in the center of the country. What about St. Louis? So he picked St. Louis. And so they wrote to the Prabhupada Bharata in India and asked, do you have anyone who subscribes to the Prabhupada Bharata magazine in St. Louis? And they had one man who subscribed to Prabhupada Bharata. So they got his address. So Swami Satprakashananda went to St. Louis, not knowing anybody, just having this one address, with a little bit of money just to rent a hotel room for a while. And so he began his work like that. And he contacted this man, and the man came to him, and the man said, are you a real Swami? And Swami Satprakashananda, taking courage in hand, said, yes, I'm a real Swami. He said, well, if you're a real Swami, then quote to me from the Upanishads. So then Swami Satprakashananda began to quote from the Upanishads, and the man said, yes, then you are a real Swami. And began to help him. He didn't have a lot of money, but began to help him in little ways, and they rented a hall. After years of work like that, pioneering work, he was ready to buy a house. And nobody in St. Louis would sell to a colored man, a man with colored skin, in a nice neighborhood. He could only get to perhaps in a black ghetto, but in a nice neighborhood, nobody would sell to him. And so he had Houston Smith buy a house in Houston Smith's name, and then turned the deed over. Of course, Swami Satprakashananda provided the money. But Houston Smith bought the present center in his name and deeded it over to Swami Satprakashananda. So these Swamis went through great difficulties and great privations to begin their work. And so it's on the shoulder of their austerities, their sacrifices, their work, that we are building the present Vedanta work. So in the 20s and 30s, there was very rapid growth of Vedanta. Many new centers were started, and the order was ready in the days of Swami Brahmananda and then Swami Shivananda to send new Swamis to the West. And working in the West was prestigious Vedanta work. So our Swamis, it was considered a great honor to be chosen and sent to the West. But in those days, they came by ship, and once they came, they knew that the chances of ever going back to India were very slim. Some Swamis did go back once in 10, 20 years, others never went back. Like Swami Satprakashananda, yes, and also Swami Aseshananda. They came and never went back. And so there's 40, 50 or more years they spent here without ever going back to India. But the 20s and 30s were years of rapid growth in this the centers. And then there was a period of consolidation during the 40s and 50s and 60s. But in the 60s and early 70s, in the aftermath of during and in the aftermath of the hippie movement, there were many young men, one of them is seated here, came and joined the order at that time. And so the late 60s and early 70s was the time when most of our monasteries were formed. San Francisco and Hollywood already had monasteries and convents, but the other centers began to form their monasteries at that time when young men were coming and wanting to deepen their spiritual life. But then in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we hit the doldrums. Neither were the number of centers expanding, nor were people joining the monasteries. And there were two reasons for this, external and internal. External meaning societal. Society itself changed in the late 70s and 80s, etc. There was a societal reaction to everything that went on in the 60s movement, both the hippie movement and the 60s radical left political movement. There was a conservative reaction within the country. So that by the 80s you would see cartoons, newspaper cartoons or magazine one-frame cartoons, where their parents with long hair and beards and hippie beads and peace symbols and everything, sitting in armchairs, and their youngsters coming with a suit and tie saying that they wanted to go to church. And they're looking, the mother and father are looking at each other and saying, where did we go wrong? So in the 80s and 90s, there was this large reaction, and continuing in the 2000s, a conservative reaction in the country and society. Also, there was an economic reaction. In the 60s, there was whatever else there was. And in India, mostly people heard about and still know about the negatives, the drugs and the free sex and all of that. But the good thing in the 60s was there was a tremendous idealism. People were idealistic and they were looking for a new way. They realized that materialism was not the answer to life's problems. And they were looking for, and there was a deep spiritual element to the 60s also. The problem was that people didn't have proper guidance, they didn't know what they were looking for, and so they ended up going in many directions that were not good for them or good for society. But the idealism was real. So you find that surveys were given to students in the late 60s at universities. And the number one priority of the majority of students in the late 60s was finding a meaningful philosophy of life and making money and getting a good job were at the very bottom. So they had a number of priorities, and at the very top was finding a meaningful philosophy of life, at the very bottom making money and getting a good job. In the 80s, they gave the same survey, to 80s and early 90s, the same survey to students. And at the top was making money, getting a good job, and at the very bottom was finding a meaningful philosophy of life. So after years in the monastery, when I hadn't had much contact with society, and 7 of those years I'd spent in India, having joined at the end of the 60s in 69, when I began to speak, when I was in charge of the San Diego Center and began to speak outside, by the mid-80s or the late 80s, this was about 1987, 88, I was invited to San Diego State University to speak. And a student had contacted me who used to come sometimes to our Vedanta Center in San Diego, and he told me that we'd like you to come and speak to our religious studies club at the university. And San Diego State was then and is now a huge university. At that time, it was something like 54,000 students at San Diego State, so a huge university. So the student told me that, we think that we'll have a large audience for you because we're advertising it widely in the university. So we think we'll have a good audience. So I was thinking back to the 60s when a good audience for a spiritual speaker from a Hindu tradition, a Swami, or from a Buddhist tradition or something, meant thousands of people would gather, and they'd have a huge auditorium and thousands of people. So when he told me that we've advertised it widely around campus and we expect a good turnout, I had a completely wrong impression of what to expect. So I went there and found the room, and it was just a little classroom about as big as this part of our auditorium, and there were about 25 students. And they were so proud that they had gotten 25 students from a student body of 54,000 to hear a lecture on the purpose of life according to Vedanta, which was a topic they had given to me. And so again, by the 80s, things in society had changed widely. So a few new sub-centers were formed, and rarely a new center would come, like Florida in the 2000s and then Houston. But growth was very stagnant, except for one thing that happened in the 60s and 70s, which has benefited our growth a great deal, and that was the liberalization of the immigration rules. So that many Indians began to come, they immigrate, so at many of our centers, though the attendance was poor, the Indian population some of them began to come. I have to say that our work in America is not generally popular in the Indian community. In Houston, I've heard that we have 300,000 Indians. And how many do we have here out of 300,000? Not many. And so many are not interested in religion, and many of those who are, they want traditional religion. They want to go to a temple and to worship a deity and get some prasad and get their daughters married or sons married and so forth, and socialize and so forth, and then we don't do any of that. And so it's those among the Indian population that's interested in spiritual life, specifically as taught in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition that come here. But still, it's because of the Indian population that a center like Houston was able to be built. And groups like Dallas and Austin and so forth are being built now. And so that's a new phenomenon. And so external societal changes were there, which still affect the spread of Vedanta in this country. But then there are internal problems. That is, things, I don't mean problems that we have, but things that we haven't done, things that we needed to do that we haven't done, we as a movement have not done. One of the things is that we haven't adapted to the times. I said at the very beginning that the problem in the West is people worship change for change's sake. And the problem with our movement as it has come from India is that people want tradition and don't want anything to change. And so we have to find a way to change where it's necessary. Our services, the manner of giving services where a Swami comes in and speaks for an hour, is based on the 19th century Protestant church services, where the sermon was the service. Maybe there'd be a little singing and so forth, but there was a long sermon given by the preacher, and that was the service. And also when Swami Vivekananda came here, when people would go for entertainment to hear lectures. You can't imagine that now, where people go for entertainment to hear lectures, but in the 19th century that was common, and early 20th century. And so our format for services was formed at that time, and we've stayed the same, even though everyone else has changed. And so one of the things we need to do is to change we don't have to get rid of lectures, otherwise I wouldn't be giving this one. We don't have to get rid of lectures, but we have to vary our methods of teaching. For one thing, modern people in the West, and that includes your own children, children of immigrants who have grown up here, as well as people like myself and Dira. They expect some participation. Just coming and have someone lecture at them and then go is not most people's idea of the best way of learning and of teaching. But they expect some sort of participation through question and answer and so forth. Another thing that we need is we need more in the way of retreats, and I mean real retreats. When I was in Gretz in France, our center outside of Paris, end of 1981, on my way back to America after 7 years in India, Swami Vidyatmananda, an American Swami who is the assistant Swami in Gretz, he told me that Swami Vidyatmananda, I think that the future of Vedanta in the West is centers like Gretz, where we have a large campus where people come and stay for the weekend, and we have programs to involve them for the whole weekend. And so when I was asked if I would go to try to start the Ridgely retreat in upstate New York, I readily agreed with that in mind, that yes, we need places like that. Needed places where people can go and spend longer amounts of time and have longer programs, not just come for a lecture and then come back the next week for another lecture and come back the next week for another lecture. We need a place where people can spend time, a weekend, a week, a month, as Sri Ramakrishna said. He said, for those who live in the world, you need to be able to go kone mone bone, to go into a corner of your house, or go into the forest, or go to the corner of your mind, to seek solitude now and then. And he would say, for a day, for a weekend, for a week, for a month, as you can do. And so we need things like that. We need programs where there are retreats. So that was my idea when I was asked to try to secure the land. We had no money. It was a huge project, but that was the idea, to begin with, begin a place where people could come and stay for shorter or longer times. And that's what we did. People would come for a day, people would come for 2 days, for a weekend, some would come for a week, and some people stayed for 6 months. staying there and attending classes and so forth. So we need to vary our means of teaching. We need classes where people feel that they're actually learning something, a particular text, like the Gita or the Upanishads and so forth, where it's not just a lecture, but where people feel that they're actually learning, and after they finish the course on the Gita, they feel that they have some handle on what it's about. So these are things we need to develop. So one thing is, as far as internal problems, or that is internal shortcomings, things that we haven't done we need to do. One is developing new ways of presenting Vedanta. Our method, of course, is not going door to door, knocking on people's doors and asking them if they found their personal savior in Sri Ramakrishna and trying to get them to come to the Vedanta Society. That's because I'm turning my head. The button has come down? Okay. Turn this off for a moment. Is it buttoned? Yeah, it's got a button on it. That one is coming. So, internal problems. One is the method of teaching. Another problem that we faced is that the original pioneers who started our centers, they came here with nothing. And they had to develop something, or else they'd be unsuccessful. But after that, once we had established centers, and none of our centers, most of our centers are not rich, one or two have plenty of money, but most are poor. But they had enough money to survive and just to continue, and a ready congregation also. And so that in many ways has made us, the Swamis, comfortable, so that we feel that, well, I've got a stable group here and have a building and everything, so just continue doing the same thing over and over again, and feeling that thereby that's enough. But the early Swamis, one thing that you see, especially the ones that were very successful, the Swami Nikhilanandas, Akhilanandas, Prabhavanandas, Ashokanandas, and others like that who were very successful, Paramanandas. What they did was that they got in touch with the American mind. They studied the culture, they studied the people. They found out what makes the people tick. What is it that inspires the people? What is it that they lack, that they need? What are they open to? What are they closed to? And so they studied the culture. And so many of the early Swamis were deeply in touch with the American mind, and because they had to be, because that's all that they could speak to. Nowadays, many of us forget that and forget the need to do that, but we have to remain open to the public mind. We've lost touch, we lost the ability to communicate with ordinary people. We get devotees coming, Ramakrishna devotees, and we can devotee talk to people. And that's good for the Ramakrishna devotees. That also is an important part of our work. But that's not all of our work. If that's all that we do, then we become just a little church, just a little sect, just a little, the Ramakrishna church. Oh, you want to go to the Ramakrishna church? Well, it's over there on Nandita Drive. That's where the Ramakrishna church is. So we become just a little church. That's not what Swami Vivekananda wanted. He didn't want a Ramakrishna church. He was always afraid that the power which Sri Ramakrishna had brought to earth would be locked inside of a temple or church, that it would be locked up and not accessible to people. So we have to be able to interface with the public mind, with the public intellect. We need to know how to talk to ordinary people. And so the two main problems I see are that we forgot that. We as a movement forgot that, and we didn't vary our program. We just continued to present Vedanta in the same way. One of the reasons why Buddhism became so successful in America is that the Buddhist teachers, for some reason, why I don't know, they realized early on that Americans were crazy about psychology and about self-improvement. So they taught Buddhism as a means, as a psychology. as a psychological technology, and as a means for self-improvement. And so that was one of the reasons, not the only, but one of the reasons why Buddhism became so successful. So we also have to, again, not to sell Vedanta. It's not, the aim is not to make it popularity for popularity's sake. The aim is not to bring more people for more people's sake. But the aim is to speak to the American mind so that we have a message to the American mind. So that we have to do. So what do we need to do in general going forward? We have to be conscious of three areas. Our own Vedantic heritage, that is, what is the truth that Vedanta from ancient times has taught? What are the central core truths and the core traditions of Vedanta? Then what is our movement's heritage? What are the elements of our movement's heritage? That is the Ramakrishna movement. What is that which is the life force of the Vedanta movement? And third, what is the national heritage of whatever country we go to, whatever country we go to and teach? I just spoke to a Swami of a different country, living in a different country, and I asked him how the work there was going. One of our Swamis in a different country, I won't mention why because of what I'm going to say next. I asked him how the work was going. He said the work is going fine, and I asked him about a new Swami who had come there. And he said, well, he has no interest in the people of our country. He has no interest in our country, in its history, in the culture. And so he says things that are offensive to people. And he's not interested in correcting it. So that's because there's no interest in the culture. Each country has its own ethos. Each country has its own ideals. France is different from Germany. Germany is different from Poland. Poland is different from Ukraine. Etc. America is different from Mexico. Mexico is different from Venezuela. Each country has its own, there are commonalities among all of humanity, and those are important. But there are also differences in the ethos from country to country. So those we have to be aware of. We have to be aware of those. So Swamiji's purpose was not to come to America to turn Americans into Indians, nor for Americans to go to India and turn Indians into Americans. That was not his purpose. His purpose was to teach the principles of Vedanta so that people in each culture could imbibe those principles and express them in their own way, so that Vedanta, as found in America, will eventually, once it's mature enough, it will develop its own tradition, and that will be different from Vedanta as developed in Mexico, which will be different from Vedanta as developed in France, which will be different from Vedanta as it has been lived for thousands of years in India. But because of the Vedanta philosophy and the universal foundation, we have to, as part of our tradition, we have to recognize the universal as well. So the fact that it's different in one place from another place, that's difference of expression, not difference of principles. Difference only of cultural expression. Much as you see what happened in Buddhism, so different from what happened in Christianity or Islam. Christianity and Islam, Christianity, when it went to different countries, they tried to turn everybody into Europeans. When Islam went into different countries, they tried to turn everyone into Arabs. That's why even now in Iran, there's so much dislike of Arabic culture, because Arabic culture was forced onto Iran, whereas they had their own ancient culture. They're Muslims, but they want to express it in their own way, not in an Arabic way. And so Swamiji didn't want that. He wanted more like what you find in Buddhism, but even more with Vedanta. In Buddhism, you find that the Buddhism of Tibet is so different from the Buddhism of Sri Lanka, which is different from the Buddhism of Vietnam, different from China, different from Korea, from Japan, and different from the new Buddhism which is growing up in America and European countries. So that we have to do, to respect the national heritage of wherever we're working. And one of the things when teaching Vedanta in this country we have to be careful of And of course, I'm speaking mainly to myself because I'm in a teaching position, and to others of those of us who are in teaching positions, is to respect the history of whatever country you go into. For instance, one of the things that a teacher from India finds when they come here is that Westerners expect to be able to question and to challenge. That doesn't mean disrespect. In India, a person is to respect the teacher to such an extent that you listen to whatever the teacher says and you just accept it. You don't challenge or you don't question. The Swami is coming here, suddenly people asking him questions, they feel, well, I'm being challenged. You know, I'm the Swami, I'm the one who teaches. And here you are challenging by asking questions and saying, oh, Swami, that doesn't make any sense. Well, to a Westerner, it just means it doesn't make any sense. And so, if you can explain it to me so it does make sense, then I'll be glad to accept it. But it needs to make sense before I'm going to accept it. And here, that doesn't mean anything bad. And so with other customs and so forth, when a Westerner comes here to our congregation, we have to be very careful that we don't try to impose Indian cultural things on them. For instance, if a Westerner comes and sits in the audience with their foot crossed like that, to tell them, oh no, that's very disrespectful. You shouldn't do that in the shrine. Cross your legs like that. No, you should sit like this. No. That's not disrespectful here. That's just a cultural difference. And so we shouldn't impose those things on people here. We can observe the things that we have learned, but we should be careful about imposing other things. Some things are good, but they should be taught gently. Like before someone works in the shrine, there are certain things that have to be observed because it's the shrine. There are other things, like with books. Swami Vivedishananda, the old Swami who founded the Seattle Center. I went to see him in 1971, the disciple of Swami Brahmananda. His center was very American because that's the only people who were there at that time. But he taught the devotees not to put books on the floor because books represent knowledge, and putting them on the floor where people walk, that's disrespectful. So that's teaching a value. But it was not just, hey, don't put that book there. What are you doing? Don't you know anything? That book doesn't go there. Without explaining why. So we have to be careful of that, respecting the culture of wherever we go. The long development of the democratic ideal, the freeing of the Western mind was something very important here, which is the Indian history is so different in that respect. Here, because as Swami Vivekananda said, religion was so oppressive for so many centuries. It produced many great saints, but at the same time it stifled the mind and was largely oppressive to the mind. And so modern science grew first within religion, but then soon as the church began to say that no, you can't teach that, to Galileo and to others, that goes against church dogma, then science began to revolt against religion. And the whole Enlightenment in Western society was a revolution against religion. And so that was what freed the Western mind so that it could think in new ways. The Indian trajectory was quite different, quite beautiful in itself, but quite different. And so that's why here, if a religious teacher tells you, as I've heard religious teachers, not ours, but when I was brought up in a church, one time a missionary came to our church to tell about his missionary work, and one of my friends in the Sunday school, he came to our Sunday school. We were kids, junior high school kids. He came to our class to tell us about his missionary work. So one of my friends raised his hand and asked a question saying, but sir, it doesn't seem to me like, don't doubt, don't doubt. That's the moment the devil will enter into you, is when you doubt. Don't doubt. Don't let questions enter into your mind. So the Western mind has fought against that type of attitude. And of course, this man didn't make any good impression on any of us kids in the class. But the Western mind expects to be able to question and so forth. So that's not considered, as all of you know, of course, but it's something we have to remember. It doesn't, or it has to be respected. So let me just end by saying a few things, repeating some things, and saying a few things about what we need to do. One of the things we need to do is to have more programmatic diversity. When I was originally, I had the idea of starting the Vedanta College, and was starting with that, using college in a very general sense, not in a accredited sense where you get college credit for going there, though that could sometime develop, but starting it informally. It's just a place where people could come for their own self-improvement, or those who wanted to help in the spreading of Vedanta also could come to learn in a systematic way, learn the scriptures, learn the traditions, learn the 4 yogas. Those who wanted to learn Sanskrit, those who wanted to learn about the mythology, those who wanted to learn about rituals and things, different things that could be learned. So programmatic changes where we have more retreats, where we have seminars, general experimentation in means of presentation, where we have schools for young people eventually. That may seem far off now, but someday we could get there. The Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, they all have their schools, so why couldn't there be a Vedanta school? And I don't mean a Hindu school, because that's not what our purpose is. Again, not to make people into orthodox traditional Hindus, but a Vedanta school in the tradition of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So even things like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, I don't mean starting a branch of them here, but starting something with the same idea. The original founding idea of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts was to teach boys and girls to be comfortable within themselves so that they wouldn't be afraid to go out into nature, they would know how to handle themselves, and to teach them to compete against themselves rather than to compete against other people. The whole idea of the merit badges and the different levels of advancement in the Scouts was based on this idea of competing against yourself. It was a wonderful idea. So even something like Vedanta Enterprises, I had this idea in San Diego. Now I'm too old to push these ideas forward, but the ideas are still there. The idea of Vedanta Enterprises was to have sort of an umbrella where people who wanted to start a small-scale business, later if they wanted to take it big scale, that would be different. They could do that from there on their own, but to have a place where people could start their business who wanted to emphasize the principles of karma yoga and the development of their enterprise. So the Vedanta Society would serve as would provide an umbrella where people could come and learn the principles of karma yoga, certain basic principles, and learn how to start their own business, and then given some support from the umbrella. Service projects, which we have huge service projects in India. Here it's very difficult to start big service projects because of all of the regulations and all of the legal liabilities and so forth. But to start on a small scale, as we've done here on a small scale, but to ramp up service activities. Some people like lectures and classes and so forth. Some people like seminars. Some people like to be engaged, like to participate, like to work. And so to have again, service projects also for people. A variety of activities for different temperaments, a variety of teachings and means of teaching for different types of people. So, finally with the Houston Center, immediately what things that I hope that we can do here. One is I want to start VIR, V-I-R, the Vivekananda Institute of Research. Veer, of course, in Sanskrit means hero, and Swamiji was the Veer. So the Vivekananda Institute of Research. And already I have so many things that need to be done. Anyone that has time and wants to participate with that could be started any time. I just have to lay out the materials and what it is that needs to be done. The things that I was doing in India, working on the complete works, but continuing that in an organized way, in a way that I couldn't even do there because I didn't have the help to do it. So starting that from now, from right now. Vivekananda Institute of Research. Growing our wonderful Sunday school program, which Shobha and Chandrani and people have done so well. What I would like to do is eventually to move the monastery from here, and I've been looking at ways to do that, out into the property here. There are ways in which we could do that quickly with the money that we have at present to build a monastery there. And then this whole wing where my room is, the guest Swami room is, where Ma Durga is, where the library is, that whole wing could be reconfigured and made into a Sunday school and perhaps library as well, but emphasizing it for Sunday school. And so upgrading our Sunday school program. And eventually we want to put a building out here also. There will be a large hall for a dining hall so that all of these tables can be moved into that hall. And that would be the dining hall and multi-purpose room. When we need a large dining hall, like on puja days and on Durga Puja, then we'd use it for that. On other days, one part would be for dining, the other part would be for classroom or for other activities. But a large hall, and then the kitchen would eventually be moved there also. So a dining hall kitchen, all of these tables could be removed, the kitchen could be removed, and then this wing could be a full-scale bookstore and an office. So there are things that we can do on the physical level with the building without much difficulty. There are ways that we can do both, moving the monastery and making a hall and kitchen. Then the Sunday school, the Vivekananda Institute of Research, and then developing service projects, small at first, so that's something that people can easily participate in, but doesn't take a lot of organization and time, but that can eventually be developed. And in that way, there are a number of other things that we can do. This is just a taste of things that we can do. And of course, the programs, the classes, the lectures. One last thing in the things that we can do that I need to start, and the burden would be on me, be on you to attend, but the burden would be on me to do it. And that is to start a meditation class where there'd be guided meditations, and that would be on Saturdays, where those who are interested could come for a meditation class, which would include meditation itself. It wouldn't be me up here giving a lecture on meditation, it would be doing a guided meditation that we all participate in. And those could be developed into retreats. In California and at Ridgely, I used to give extensive retreats. California, I used to give all-day retreats on a variety of meditation topics. And in Ridgely Manor, I used to give a variety of 3-day retreats, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, where people could come and stay at Ridgely Manor. That we can't do here. But we could easily do 1-day or even 2-day retreats with people who are living in the area. So anyway, that's for the future. And in the midst of all of that, we just have to remember Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that the ultimate purpose of life is the realization of God. These are all means. These are all things that we can do so that we are helping ourselves and helping others to realize God. So with that, I will close for today. And as often happens, I'm sorry for that, often happens that time is over time, so I won't ask for questions. And again, I had wanted to ask for questions today in particular to hear your ideas. But on another day, I will talk more about this, about specifics, and also about the need for volunteers. That's not asking for people who don't have time to make time forcibly. It's asking for people who want to volunteer. There's many areas of work here, or several areas of work here, where we need people who are willing to help. Whether it's with kitchen things on Sundays, like making the khichdi, whether it's in the Sunday school, whether it's in the library, whether it's in the bookstore, whether it's with the filming. That's an area where we especially need somebody. Whether it's the website, where we need people to help with the website. So all of these things are areas that we need help. And so on another Sunday, I'll speak about that. So let me give the closing prayer, and then we'll have arati and then lunch. Om Dyo Shantihi Antariksham Shantihi Prithivi Shantihi Apa Shantihi Oshadaya Shantihi Vanaspataya Shantihi Vishve Deva Shantihi Brahma Shantihi Sarvam Shantihi Shantireva Shantihi Sama Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace is in the heavens, peace is in the sky, peace is on earth, peace is in the waters, peace in the plants and the trees. The gods are peace. Peace is the nature of truth. Peace, real peace. May that peace, real peace, be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.